Uno.
Hola, saludos a quienes nos
Recording in progress.
acompañan en Zoom y en la transmisión de YouTube. Mi nombre es Carla Mariana Huerta y estoy acompañada de Suset Celaya. Somos parte del equipo editorial de Noro. Noro es una plataforma digital de contenido periodístico que busca representar la voz del noroeste de México, conectando a través de las historias de los emprendedores y creativos de esta región. En Noro estamos emocionadas por auspiciar esta conferencia, pues tenemos la seguridad de que temas como este a veces nos permiten abrir el diálogo alrededor de las realidades que vivimos, pero que a veces no sabemos cómo nombrar o reconocernos parte de ellas. Entonces, creemos que es un parteaguas para seguir hablando de estos temas y abrir a la conversación con los demás.
Y bueno, al igual que lo hizo Noro, hay otras instituciones que también contribuyeron a que Materia Abierta fuera posible en esta edición virtual y extendemos un agradecimiento a ellas. En primer lugar tenemos a la UNAM, en coordinación con Cultura UNAM, con Casa del Lago, con el programa de Arte, Ciencia y Tecnología, el programa ACT, y la Cátedra Max Au en Arte y Tecnología. Igualmente, extender el agradecimiento a Cádiz, a la Galería de Arte Peana, al Museo Tamayo y al Departamento de Arte de la Universidad de Monterrey, de la UDEM, y pues agregando a Noro, ¿no? Que aquí estamos nosotros auspiciando en esta ocasión la sesión. Y bueno, entrando un poco y de manera breve en contexto, el programa de este año se llama Ni Apocalipsis ni Paraíso, Meditaciones en el Umbral. Y bueno, Materia Abierta es una escuela de verano sobre teoría, arte y tecnología que se estableció inicialmente en Ciudad de México. Ahí eran las clases de manera presencial, que con la colaboración de los docentes que tan atinadamente se conforman en cada año. El programa busca construir un espacio en donde se pueda reflexionar sobre este presente que nos rodea, un ejercicio tan necesario para conocer y conocernos. Igualmente, en Materia Abierta fomenta la discusión crítica sobre, entre otros temas, el mundo que se construye a través de las pantallas y sobre cómo todos nos desenvolvemos pues en esa virtualidad, ¿no? Y bueno, curiosamente, si bien Materia Abierta inició de forma presencial, así como era nuestra vida antes de la pandemia, bueno, esta situación vino a trastocar nuestras formas de socializar y de aprender. Y bueno, esto llevó a que, como les comentaba, Materia Abierta en esta ocasión se llevara por completo en este plano virtual. Así se imparten las sesiones, así se imparten los talleres y bueno, confirmando justamente lo que postula Materia Abierta. Otras formas de aprender y otras formas de hacer comunidad son posibles.
Y bueno, partiendo de esta realidad y la nueva modalidad que ya mencionó Suset, en la que nos encontramos y en la que coexistimos a través de las pantallas de esta virtualidad, es importante realizar una reflexión crítica alrededor de estas plataformas, de la simulación y de los mundos que construimos a través de las pantallas, mismos que ahora son el eje temático de la conferencia que escucharemos esta mañana. Con simulación y especulación, el arte en el mundo post-videojuegos, se analizarán las relaciones que se establecen entre el arte contemporáneo y los videojuegos. On behalf of Noro, we would like to welcome you today, Don Chan, y a continuación cederemos la palabra a Mónica Hoff y Eva Posas, responsables de la curaduría de este bonito programa de Materia Abierta. Gracias.
Gracias, Carla. Gracias, Suset. Thank you, Don. Es un placer estar con ustedes. Buenos días, tardes, noches a todos. Estamos en muchos horarios distintos. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros en esta segunda actividad pública de Ni Apocalipsis ni Paraíso, Meditaciones en el Umbral. Este programa que justo empieza su tercera semana hoy y que en esta edición de Materia Abierta, como ha comentado Suset y Carla, se organiza totalmente online. El principal ejercicio de esta edición es un programa que se empezó a diseñar hace 2 años huir de las teorías sobre el fin del futuro como el fin del mundo, y así de las políticas de salvación, de los simulacros edénicos y de los miles de intentos de preservar una idea de futuro bajo el orden de un proyecto de Jason del cual ya no queremos participar. Apuesta así por caminos menos lineales de conciencia, pensamiento y creación, organizándose desde experiencias y saberes que en su divergencia con la linealidad construyen diversidad y consecuentemente formas de coexistir que nos invitan a imaginar otros socioecosistemas. Desde nuestro punto de vista, los sueños, el conocimiento entrañado, la vida que se desarrolla bajo la tierra, la poesía, las prácticas de sanación política y la combinación transversal de todo eso se configuran como formas de construir estos otros caminos que nos permiten ir más allá de las formas de vida consagradas que garantizan justamente el futuro del cual queremos escapar. En este segundo encuentro público del programa, para presentar sus investigaciones más recientes sobre arte en un mundo post-videojuegos, tenemos el honor de recibir a Don Sean.
Gracias a todos los que han hablado previamente, Suset, Carla, Mónica. Hi again, Don. Sí, creo que ya se comentó un poco de qué va a ir esta plática que nos emociona muchísimo y bueno, pensando que definitivamente los videojuegos ya, más allá de ser la distracción o entretenimiento de los adolescentes, juegan un papel importante en la cultura contemporánea, ¿no? Y bueno, es por eso que en este momento I'm gonna switch to, voy a cambiar a inglés y I'm switching to English to read the biography of Don. Don Sean is a New York-based writer and editor whose work has been published in the Atlantic Book Forum, the New York Times, New Yorker, the Paris Review, and the Village Voice, among other publications. She also frequently contributes to our forum, where she worked as an editor from 2007 to 2018. Currently on the faculty at CCS Bard, Dan has lectured at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Rhode Island School of Design, and New York University. Anthologized in volumes from Whitechapel, MIT Press, Paper Monument, and Museum de Moderne Salzburg, her writing has also been recognized with a Thomas Foundation Art Writing Award in Digital Art and a Warhol Arts Writers Grant. In 2019-20, Sean was on the curatorial team that organized Phantom Plane, Cyberpunk in the Year of the Future at Tycoon's JC Contemporary in Hong Kong. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Don, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you all so much for the warm welcome. Can you all hear me? Can everyone hear? Okay, great. So first of all, I really do want to apologize that I don't know Spanish, and so I thank you for your patience as we do today's lecture in English. I will be inviting you all to sort of contribute to the conversation as well. So thank you for your patience in that regard too, as I'll have to ask you to speak to me in English. Also, I wanted to ask just really quickly, what is, we're aiming for 1 p.m. for the end of my portion of speaking, is that correct? Or sorry, in Mexico time, what would be the final time that you would like me to wrap up? I just want to be mindful of our time constraints so I don't end up speaking for, I don't end up being one of those speakers who speaks on and on for like 3 hours.
We don't have like a really tight schedule for it, so you can last as long as you have planned the lecture. But okay. I think like thinking about 45 minutes, an hour is okay. Good. And we'll have like a 15 minutes Q&A session, if that's okay. All right.
That's absolutely great. So yes, thank you all so much for inviting me here today. Thank you to Eva, Monica, Federico, Noro. It's such an exciting program of people you've put together. So it's a real honor to be a part of this. And I'm also very, very thrilled to see how many people there are from different parts of the world. It's a real opportunity for me to interface with so many of you. And I'm particularly excited about sort of our global diversity, in large part because of today's topic, which, as you know, has to do with art and video games. I think video games, and video games historically especially, really get at our global interconnectedness. As many of you probably know, so many games, so much of the history of video games has been about sort of simulating contact between people. As you know, so many video games enable this sort of rehearsal and formation of social coordination between people around the world. And I don't mean to gloss over the problems of video games. Often the sort of social coordination enabled is not necessarily utopian at all. Often it involves conflict, it involves strife, but it does kind of create these structures of social coordination that mirror our struggles around the world to connect and unite, sometimes in conflict and sometimes in attempts to find ways to resolve that conflict. As I'm speaking, I would also love to invite all of you in the chat box to tell me a little bit about your own engagement with video games. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you to do that in English since I can't read Spanish, but I'd be very curious if whether you're an artist coming to this today with as someone who, you know, occasionally plays, you know, a game or two on your phone maybe, or as someone who never touches video games but sees a sibling participate, or, you know, as someone who maybe just, you know, doesn't really interface with video games at all. I'd be very curious to hear sort of what your level of engagement is and how you engage if you do. I guess a bit about my background. I am not a video game scholar, and there are many such scholars in the world. Certainly people within media studies who have kind of made it their you know, point of expertise to read and write for the corpus of video game studies. So I don't pretend to be one of those people. And if anything, I think it might be best to understand my position as I come here today as well as an art critic, I suppose, as an art critic who maybe relative to perhaps many other art critics has played more than her fair share of video games. I guess you could also see me as you know, someone who's very fascinated by video games and who's played video games, and in that context has spent quite a bit of my own time thinking about contemporary art. But all of this is to say that I hope you don't expect my knowledge of video games to be comprehensive. It's not by any means. And I'm sure if there are gamers of you out there, I would love to hear, you know, about video game examples that you throw into the mix, into the conversation, that maybe I don't know about. I look forward to learning about examples that resonate in your own lives and in your own practices. I also just want to give a heads up. This is a sort of trigger warning, if you will. As most of you may be aware, there are connections in video games, especially early video games, to military interests. And obviously many video games are quite violent. There's sort of a logic to the connection between video games and violence that we'll go into a bit. You know, and then of course, sort of global capitalist ideologies are played out in video games, resource extraction, sort of, you know, state-sponsored, you know, institutions of repression, all get kind of refracted throughout this medium. So some of the material in that regard may be a bit disturbing. And there's also, I think, one video that has some flashing pixels. So I'll try to give a heads up before we play that, just in case that causes issues for anyone watching. So I guess I'll share my screen now. Let me see if I can get the tech to work on this. Oh, and I'm seeing people contribute their, in the chat, their engagement with video games. So I'm very pleased that you're doing this, and I'm going to be looking over this as we go. Okay, so okay, and then I have to. So is everyone able to see my screen right now? Okay, great. So yes, this is simulation and speculation post-video game art. And I just wanted to start with a quote by media theorist Mackenzie Wark. She writes, game space seeps into everyday life, moving through its pores, transforming it into its own image, turning up everywhere from cell phone Tetris to your quarterly pension fund statement. Rather than a timeless utopian ideal where history ends, rather than the allotted hour of the heterotopian, everyday life now pulses constantly with moments of unrealized utopian promise. And one thing I really like about this quote, one reason I wanted to include it, was because I think it does a very good job of sort of capturing the ways that video games aren't sort of a niche subcultural phenomenon, but rather they've kind of permeated our broader visual culture, permeated the sort of logic of daily life in ways that we probably don't realize, and may remain invisible, particularly if you don't actively go out and seek to play video games yourself. And this is followed by, next slide, a quote by video game and media scholar Aubrey Anable, who brings up this possibility that video games are neither merely repressive nor liberatory, but rather a whole way of life. And I would like to be coming back to that point throughout the talk, kind of bouncing back to that idea, because I think it can be easy to either kind of come at video games with a very critical stance, or with a sort of ultra optimistic, sort of techno-utopian stance that this may be the next medium that can save all of us. And I think for us as artists and cultural practitioners, to be able to be mindful of what can move beyond that binary is the way that we will be able to kind of think about video games and their effect, their sort of the consequences that have played out on visual culture in the most interesting ways possible. And here's one more quote I wanted to include. This is by Espen Arseth. I hope I'm pronouncing their name correctly. And the quote I'll read is, simulations allow us to test their limits, comprehend causalities, establish strategies, and effect changes in ways clearly denied us by fictions, but quite like in reality. And as you'll see, this connects to future points I want to bring up made by various other scholars. I like this idea that maybe narratives and fictions as we understand them traditionally do one thing, but this idea of a sort of algorithm that allows us to simulate reality can actually do or perform something very different in the world, something with a different utility and a different sort of different set of consequences. So a lot of my research in general, not just about art and video games, but about our digital life, has been coming back to an article by Katherine Hayles. You may have seen in the short syllabus we shared that this article was made available. And the article covers a lot of, this piece of writing covers a lot of terrain. She goes into sort of literary theory and, ideas about, and goes into, the ideas of floating signifiers and redefines them as flickering signifiers in this more contemporary digital age. And I'm not saying that we need to get into the weeds of all of that, but I do find a point that Hayles makes early on in the piece very, very useful. And it's this point of absence versus presence starting to be displaced by an alternate binary, which is pattern versus randomness. And, I think Hales's point is crucial. It's become a sort of framework for so much of the thinking that I do around digital, around our digital lives. And I don't, when I run this by people, some people find it very intuitive, find it very resonant right away. Other people seem to find it a bit abstract. So let me just kind of talk about the ways this idea resonates with me. Hayles writes about the highly heterogeneous and fissured space in which discursive formations based on pattern and randomness jostle and compete with formations based on presence and absence. Okay, so this is a bit abstract for now, but what does this all mean? We look at sort of pre, I guess, 20th century notions of presence and absence, sort of visual markers indicating presence or indicating an absence of what was once present. There is of course this chalk outline of someone who was there, who is not. Here's another image kind of denoting this idea, someone who will be there, will be present, but is currently absent, and a sign marking their future presence. And this sort of presence versus absence binary is something that has been so kind of entrenched that it's perhaps very obvious to the point where it was rather invisible. It was something that didn't need major discussion, which isn't to say obviously that philosophers have pondered what it means to exist throughout time, what it means to be present. But as people start to begin to understand complex systems that are modeled and simulated with the help of computation, because they are so complex that we don't sort of intuitively grasp them, then the question starts to shift. And, maybe one sort of very quick and easy way to understand all of this is to think about the shift from analog to digital. So, obviously, as we have a record player, you consider the record there being an artifact that is present. It is, it is an object that kind of carries with it the music, and it has a physical presence with it. And then we move into the age of MP3s now. This is a file representing an MP3. And so as you can see, it's represented as a data stream. And what ends up kind of being the music is a change in the patterns of data that are presumably being transmitted through the internet. And I think we're all sort of internalizing this shift. So one of the early simulations that gets at the sort of new binary between pattern and randomness, and the ways that plays into our sense of what is significant, was this game of life, which was invented by a British mathematician named John Conway. This was invented in 1970. The name Game of Life is rather funny because it's not necessarily a game as many of us would define it. And whether or not there is any life in this remains to be debated. But this is a tutorial that can be found online that someone made explaining the game of life. Essentially, there are a very fixed set of rules that govern the ways that pixels in a grid turn on or off. And so I'll start this video. Please, someone let me know if you cannot hear the sound to this video, because it's rather essential.
This is John Conway's Game of Life. The Game of Life consists of some squares in a space. They are the points in space, sometimes referred to as cells. And a point can be either on or off. Black is on, white is off. And you can also call it alive or dead. Now there's a simple rule that tells us whether or not cells stay alive or they die. And that's this. If a cell has if it has no neighbors that are alive, it dies. If it has just one neighbor that's alive, it'll die. So both of these will die. But if it has two neighbors that are alive, it'll stay alive. So look what happens to this cell. It's going to stay alive on the next moment of time. Of course, something else weird happened there, right? These two died, and these two became alive. They were born. Let's look at that again. This cell only has one live neighbor. It's going to die. Same here. It's going to die. So on the next generation, that one will die and that one will die. But there's a rule for birth, and the rule for birth is this. If a cell has exactly 3 live neighbors, it will be born. This cell has exactly 3 live neighbors, and so does that one. So these two will die, and that will be born. And you can see what's going to happen now. By symmetry, it's just going to go back to a horizontal bar, and we have now just an oscillator. We're continuing here with Conway's Game of Life, and let's look at this pattern. We've got a square, we've got a square, we've got a square. Those are all on. These points or cells are on or alive. They're energized. So this cell has 2 live neighbors. It's going to stay alive. This cell has 2 live neighbors. It'll stay alive. This cell, the same 2 live neighbors. It'll stay alive. And let's look at this one. That one has 3 live neighbors, so it's going to be born. And that's what happens. It's born. Now, this is a stable pattern, right? Each of these cells has 3 live neighbors. It's alive, and so it's going to stay alive. The surrounding cells don't have enough energy. They don't have enough life around them to be born. So this is just going to be a stable pattern. I'm actually stepping through time, but nothing happens. So that's an interesting pattern. Let's look at this pattern now. Hard to say what this one's going to do, but look what's going to happen. We need to use computers to figure this out. If we had to calculate this by hand, that would be a little rough. It's going to change. Now you can see it looks like it's rotated itself, right, horizontally or vertically. And the same again, you see a reappearance of a pattern. And look at that. That's just back to where it was, except it's back to the same pattern that it was, except it's shifted one to the right and one down. That's a glider. It glides. It moves. Let's look at the glider in a little bit more detail here. There it is. There's a glider that's ready to glide. So here, let's go. Let's step it through time a little bit. There's the next moment of time, the next moment of time, the next moment of time, the next moment of time. You can see it's moved. It's kind of walked. But what are we talking about when we say it? What is the glider? I mean, the cells aren't moving. The points in space don't move. The points in space remain the same. They remain in their same relations with each other. They don't move around. All that's moved is the pattern of qualities, right? The pattern of colors, black and white. And if you think of those as energy, then you've got a moving energy pattern. The glider is a kind of particle, but it's an energetic particle. It's like a vortex moving through space. It's a pattern of energy that moves through space, and because of its regularity, because of its invariance, because of the way its shapes repeat every fourth cycle, it seems to have its own independent existence.
Okay, so, you know, I have mixed feelings about this video. On the one hand, I really appreciate the sort of poetry with which this YouTube creator describes the pattern as an energy pattern. And I think that's kind of trying to access some of the beauty of this game. But also, I don't know if I would agree with calling it an energy pattern. I think he certainly does get at important questions. What is it when we talk about it? It certainly looks like there is something there that's present, that's not absent, that's moving, that's traversing a distance. But in this sort of newer formation of pattern versus randomness, we actually end up toggling between that idea of an it moving with the ultimate understanding too that these are all just a grid of pixels on a screen, each square representing one pixel that either turns on and off. And so I'll move on to the next video. This kind of captures some of the some of the sort of, I guess, aesthetic properties of the patterns that emerge from this game. And again, just to kind of go back to how it might or might not be a game, no one's really kind of playing with it over time. If you're kind of interacting with a computer that kind of plays out the rules of this game of life, what you end up doing is giving it a start state, kind of selecting certain pixels to turn on and off, and then letting this simulated world run based on its own rules. And so here's one video of a particular pattern that someone at some point picked out and then watched kind of grow and bloom into something more complex. Sorry, that's loud. And so this goes on for a very long time. Obviously, parts of the pattern become stable. Parts of the pattern seem to kind of create reverberations that where we could say parts of the pattern seem to move around. But I think all of this kind of gets at this sort of new aesthetic of pattern versus randomness being like a new formation that we sort of inherently pay attention to, and a formation that I think we're being conditioned to understand as intuitive more and more over time. Certainly, if we thought about how we understood ourselves, even 10 years ago, even certainly 20 years ago, it would have been inconceivable to think of ourselves as and to think of our value to larger institutions as sort of data points, as sets of vectors, as people who do certain things that can be aggregated and compared with millions of other people who do certain things, such that the doing of those things itself becomes a pattern that has even incredible financial value to a company like Facebook or Twitter, or anything that's kind of scraping data to try to find order. And so it's even sort of affecting how we see our our own selves and our own value. So here is a quick GIF or GIF. There will be sort of flashing pixels, but I included this because I think it does kind of get again at the sort of digital age representation of a sort of nod toward things being present and absent, but in the end, these are sort of patterns of pixels on the screen. So I'm going to start playing it. It's going to have a bit of flashing. And you see these sorts of gestures toward an architectural space, but really they're not. Okay, so it's over. And I'll move to the next slide now. So this is again from Hayles' article. She writes, at the same time that absence was reconceptualized in post-structuralist theory, so that it is not mere nothingness, but a productive force seminal to discourse and psycholinguistics. So randomness was reconceptualized in scientific fields, so that it is not mere gibberish, but a productive force essential to the evolution of complex systems. And if you think about AI, I'm interjecting my own comments here, obviously, right now. If you think about the way that AI is often trained, it begins from a state of kind of random weights. It begins as this entity that's open to the world, but kind of doesn't reflect the world's realities. It's sort of, each of a neural network's nodes is kind of set with random weights. And then as it kind of is fed a lot of information, that randomness gradually becomes replaced by order. But there is that sort of key step where randomness is kind of integral to its beginnings. So back to the Hayles quote. The parallel suggests that the dialectic between absence and presence came clearly into focus because it was already being displaced as a cultural presupposition by randomness and pattern. So presence and absence were forced into visibility because they were already losing their constitutive power to form the ground for discourse, becoming instead discourse's subject. And I think that's a fascinating, fascinating position to take, and one that we can certainly debate. I think it's interesting to think about in the context of, of visual art and visual arts progression as well. As we know, this is around the middle of the 20th century that these kind of ideas about complex systems are forming, and also the first video games are being made. And if Hayles is arguing that the question of presence and absence is kind of brought to the fore because it can no longer be an invisible dominant background, then is that possibly connected to developments we see around that time in art history as well? I don't know, but I'm just going to put that out there. We start to see conversations as minimalism blooms and minimalist art comes to the fore. We see conversations about theatricality and the presence of the viewer's body as being integral to the work. We also see big conversations arise, fervent conversations arise around site specificity and what it means for an artwork to only have meaning if and when it is present at a certain place in the world. And that brings me to a quote by scholar Mi-Won Kwon. She writes about site specificity and kind of makes some of the connections in the shifts in our understandings around site specificity, the move away from site as a particular presence at a particular place to something more transitory and portable. And anyway, so she does connect that to electronic spaces of the internet and cyberspace. So I'll just read this quote right here. This is in the context of a chapter on how artwork that's ostensibly site specific does start to move around and appear at different institutions, and the idea of site becomes expanded. So Kwon writes, site is now structured intertextually rather than spatially, and its model is not a map, but an itinerary, a fragmentary sequence of events and actions through space that is a nomadic narrative whose path is articulated by the passage of the artist. So corresponding to the model of movement in electronic spaces of the internet and cyberspace, which are likewise structured as transitive experiences, one thing after another and not in synchronic simultaneity. Here is a famous, I guess you could call it a new media work, although that term, obviously itself brings about big conversations. But here is a famous digital work by the artist Corey Archangel, which I think kind of brings to the fore this question of absence and presence versus pattern and randomness. So Archangel famously took the video game Super Mario Brothers and hacked it, removing all of the information encoded in the game, except for the patterns that yield the representation of clouds drifting across the sky slowly. And I think, again, it's interesting to see how often when this work is described, it's described as a very minimal piece, as something that, when it's described as such, has overtones of minimalism that we think, that make us think about Judd, that make us think about the conversations that Michael Fried began. And this question of, is the viewer's body implicated, or is this, again, is this now just purely about pattern and randomness? This is another work by digital artist collective Jody. Let me turn the sound down on this because I think it can be loud. But this was it was, along similar lines. They took I guess a violent video game called Wolfenstein. I think it's about escaping from a Nazi dungeon. And they removed almost all of the identifying information. So I'll play it and you can get a sense of what it looks like. Oh wait, let me just go back.
Urgency. 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 Boom.
And so as you can see, this video game does have sort of vestigial traces of its violent first-person shooting qualities, but they've removed so much information that it kind of becomes more of a gesture at its geometric parts. This is a hack that emphasizes that this is not really an architectural space that can be present or absent, but it is a pattern of geometric shapes that simulates some sort of experience of architectural space. So as many people have pointed out, as many scholars have pointed out, the roots of video games themselves are deeply intertwined with the sort of military-industrial complex and the legacy of Cold War, thinking of cybernetics, the use of systems to understand communications between people and machines, and the thinking around how such systems could be advantageous toward particular state interests. And it's absolutely no accident that what's usually considered the first video game was made by a physicist who was actually on the team at Los Alamos that built the first nuclear bomb, which I think is an absolutely chilling fact that cannot be overemphasized enough. This was an American physicist named William Higginbotham who designed the game in 1958. It was shown on an oscilloscope. I'm sorry, this is so loud. And it was called Tennis for Two. You can see people playing it on controllers. So this is kind of a rudimentary early video game that certainly fascinated people, captured their attention. And I think, I would guess that I'm not the only one who would argue that video games are part of this history of state-sponsored oppression and violence, in large part because of the ability of simulation to overcome limitations of the body and distance, and the kind of growing awareness that these abilities of simulation to overcome these limitations are hugely advantageous in the logic of conquest and invasion, and in the sort of acts of dehumanization that need to be performed in order to successfully pull off conquest and invasion. And, as is not surprising, this sort of logic of dehumanization through simulation reaches what I think is an absolutely chilling peak when you look at the work of drone operators. So this is a news clip from the US. Okay, I'll learn my lesson and turn down the volume first.
This is the aircraft they're flying across the Nevada desert. They'll soon be navigating a similar Reaper in the skies above terror hotspots around the globe, without ever leaving the state.
This is a base at war every day. These metal containers have been turned into air-conditioned cockpits, and the pilots who are inside them are training to fly missions all over the world.
600 pilots and 350 sensor or camera operators work in teams around the clock.
Go for the air conditioning unit.
Averaging 6 airstrikes and 1,000 combat hours every day.
And I think it's not surprising that you see in the comments below this video that people are immediately making the connection between the ostensible value, or at least what's perceived as the value of these drone operators, and the video games they experience as their childhood. So someone saying, I grew up hearing video games are a waste of time. And somehow this proves that they're not. I also just, Ava, Federico, Monica, I just want to let you know that I'll probably go over about 10 or 15 minutes. So I hope that's okay, but let me know if I need to wrap things up. So the artist Wafa Bilal famously created a very powerful work that I think arguably tries to address the gap created by simulation and interface that allows for dehumanizing logic and sort of abstraction to come into play. So Bilal made a web interface that controlled a paintball gun. The paintball gun was in a room where he lived for 30 days. And so visitors to the website could control the paintball gun to point at him and shoot at him. And here he is in a talk at Weizmann Art Museum describing the work a little bit. There's also video of him kind of creating there's footage of him creating a video diary as this work is going on, which I didn't include because it actually, I think, is very traumatic. You hear the sound of paintball gun fire in the background as he's talking, and you can kind of hear the alarm in his voice. But I will share
that project
clip.
I proposed.
We'll share this clip here.
To move my living space into the gallery, launch a website, and the website is connected to a robot I built, which is a paintball gun as well, and to allow people from all over the world to see and shoot the Iraqi for 30 days. At the end of that 30 days, I was shot at 70,000 times from 128 countries with 80 million hits on the website. But the most rewarding thing it was the chat room I launched on that site. More than 3,000 pages of people interacting with each other.
And so I think, this work this artwork does the important work of kind of critiquing the ways in which this level of abstraction and sort of, I guess, undermining of distance allowed by simulation, allowed by interface. This work does the work of critiquing the ways that can desensitize, and that's obviously a very important stance to take. But I think obviously not all art has to be critical of the sort of potential of video games to dehumanize and desensitize. There are also interesting ways I think various people have proposed that it can attune, that the medium can attune us to things that other media cannot. So that brings us to the media theorist Alexander Galloway. I believe this was in the readings as well. But I wanted to start with Galloway's point about how video games and film do different things. This point is very interesting because I think it also, for artists and for people who have kind of artistic or curatorial or experimental practices, it hints at the ways that you all, as you make art that's cognizant of video games, can do things in the world that are different from art that's just conscious of film alone. So the way Galloway puts it is that the political sleight of hand of mainstream cinema is that the audience is rarely shown the boring minutiae of discipline and confinement that constitute the various apparatuses of control in contemporary societies. The accurate representation of political control is thus eclipsed in much of cinema, which is unfortunate because despite its unsexy screen presence, informatic control is precisely the most important thing to show on the screen if one wishes to allegorize political power today. So, right, and I think this is kind of fairly universal. I think this transcends sort of national boundaries of film and TV production. I would imagine, certainly in my experience, both in American media and East Asian media, if you watch a police procedural, it's kind of ironic that it's called a procedural because you end up getting a narrative that really filters out the bureaucracy, that filters out the minutiae of discipline and confinement, as Galloway points out. And so, as he writes, video games don't attempt to hide informatic control, they flaunt it. And the gamers instead learning, internalizing, and becoming intimate with a massive, multi-part global algorithm. And here, I think, is an example of something that amplifies the sort of ways that a consumer of video games, as opposed to cinema, encounters a sort of magnified experience of the algorithm of information control, and that this is something that kind of attunes us to these things to the point of absurdity. So this is a video. This is footage from a game called Job Simulator. Certainly not a game that I myself would see playing very much. It seems rather, it seems to kind of mire you in the mundanity of daily life, which is the point, to the point where it's quite hilarious. So I'll play it right now.
Hello, human. Welcome to an accurate simulation of office worker. Take a look at this board for instructions.
Hey, that almost hurt.
Workers would traditionally start their day with an addictive liquid stimulant. Also, workers would ingest a frosted sugar Taurus for sustenance. Now you're ready to start your day. Ah, the freedom of Inbox Zero.
Right, and so there's something that's, that pushes this to the point of absurdity, and that's the humor of this game. But it's also somehow compelling, and we have to think about why it's not just a joke someone told about a possible game. This is actually a game. There was actually the calculation made somewhere that there's something compelling enough about performing and repeating and rehearsing these sorts of repetitive tasks, the sorts of minute kind of acts that play into the algorithms of information control, that's somehow rewarding or compelling to the player. And it's striking how many of these simulations that kind of attune us to that in some ways we've moved on from, are actually set in realms that have a real world equivalent that's often very physically difficult or laborious or even dangerous. So you think about all the farming games that exist out there, which is kind of incredible and ironic, because when you think about how huge swaths of the world have kind of left behind agrarian economic models, and now those of us in these swaths of the world who are kind of maybe in more urban settings, in jobs that interface with the digital realm, are now playing these games that simulate sort of agrarian productivity. And we also have to consider how mind-blowing it is that one of the most popular games of all time is about mining. It's about this act of resource extraction that is incredibly dangerous and often historically has involved the exploitation of laborers, and something that is not only physically dangerous but also monotonous. And I want to raise the question of what it is about the simulation of this sort of activity. And I should share that I have played a lot of Minecraft myself, but so it makes me wonder what it is about the simulation of this activity, what it is about the changing of the stakes when you mine for ores in a simulated world instead of a real one, that suddenly turns it into an act that we seek out, an act of repetitiveness that is actually compelling. And that brings me to another game, which kind of takes I guess, the challenges of a physical body to an even more heightened sort of game space. This is called The Long Dark. It's a survival video game, and this is one of a genre of many such video games. So this is a game where, you know, you're essentially trying to survive in a very resource poor setting, and it's relentless and brutal, and eventually there's kind of no other outcome than you know, your simulated death at the end of the game. But the goal is to kind of postpone that simulated death for as long as possible. And so we see this player walking us through
beef jerky.
finding
Pretty much lasts forever.
resources.
Good, because I might need it. Sorry, fella, but you ain't gonna need this where you're headed. So anyway, this is The Long Dark, guys and gals, and I know you love my roleplay intros.
And so this is a simulation of someone kind of on the brink of starvation and hypothermia, wandering through a cold forest. And what it is that is compelling about games like this, I think, is a huge open question. I also think it connects to a sort of fascinating tidbit I came across recently. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. First, we'll just connect this again to the art world. So this is a shot of a performance piece by the artist Diego Leclerc, which was called Me Playing Civilization, and it was presented at the Whitney Biennial in 2014. And the performance, or I guess the artwork, consisted solely of Leclerc sitting at a computer playing the video game called Civilization for the entire run of the work. And so, of course, I think the attempt of the work was to raise questions about labor and artistic labor, and you know, to what ends that labor is directed when it involves sort of hermetic enclosed worlds like a video game. And this also goes to another wider quote by Aubrey Anable, who argues that video games must be understood as more than just ideological training grounds for capitalism. So more than sort of ways to train us to mine for ores and labor as office workers, and to farm. And while it is important to trace the ways video games harness our bodies to the 21st century rhythms of labor and leisure in particular ways, we must also account for the aspects of video games that cannot be reduced to the military entertainment complex. Video games, she writes, are neither merely repressive nor liberatory, but rather a whole way of life. And that connects to a sort of tidbit about Edward Snowden that I came across that I found incredibly compelling and fascinating. So as you all probably know, Snowden is a controversial American figure who was kind of acting on his own moral principles. He left the country and disclosed to journalists that the US had a very comprehensive surveillance program that was listening in on the communications of many people, including American citizens, without warrants, which you know, was a disclosure that violates a lot of the basic, you know, what are understood to be the rights of American citizens in the country. And there's a GQ profile about Snowden written by journalist Glenn Greenwald, who worked extensively with him. And in the profile, Greenwald wrote that Snowden saw himself as a sort of traditional video game hero. So here's an excerpt from the article by Greenwald, which I'll read. So in Hong Kong, Snowden told me that at the heart of most video games is an ordinary individual who sees some serious injustice, right? Like some person who's been kidnapped and you have to rescue them, or some evil force that has obtained this weapon and you've got to deactivate it or kill them or whatever. And it's all about figuring out ways to empower yourself as an ordinary person to take on powerful forces in a way that allows you to undermine them in pursuit of some public good, even if it's really risky or dangerous. And that moral narrative at the heart of video games was part of his pre-adolescence and formed part of his moral understanding of the world and one's obligation as an individual. And I think it's interesting that Snowden cited video games and not sort of classic Hollywood blockbusters as the sort of formative experience that determined the actions he would later take. Because as you all know, there are plenty of high budget movies in which feature kind of a main character that also goes rogue, follows his or her kind of own moral compass and takes some sort of individually guided action towards their perceived sense of moral good, which results in the world being saved or the main character becoming a hero or heroine. And I think it's fascinating that video games in particular were, Snowden found them formative, because if we go back to Galloway, unlike cinema, which would have a sort of heightened act of heroism, video games enabled a repetition and rehearsal of this heroic narrative. So making it a thing that you could practice with lower stakes. And I think video games for Snowden may have also enabled a sort of rehearsal and a practice of profound isolation. It's an isolation that became very real once he took his later path of being a whistleblower. But there's sort of clearly a very lonely life that gets practiced and played out and simulated when you play video games, especially first person, single player games. So there are often non-playing characters that may help you along the way, but the story is kind of deeply about you and yourself sitting with your own actions and your own decisions in the end. And it's funny to see that there's this strange circle that happens. So it begins with Snowden growing up inspired by video games. And then after he carries out his acts of whistleblowing, there end up being a whole crop of video games that then are made with Snowden as the main character based on his actions. It seems like there are at least 3 or 4 that I could find on the internet. This is a scene from a game called Snowden Run. And here is a video of another one, I guess called Escape from Hong Kong. I was actually struck by this one because it kind of charts his journey around the world. You can see he's in Hong Kong and then he levels up and makes it to Ecuador and then continues from there, I think goes on to Venezuela. And there are many other stops along the way. But it's kind of it's kind of striking and funny because it takes this individual protagonist's kind of lonely, zigzagging, winding journey around the world, a journey of deep isolation and displacement, and then maps it onto the logic of video games, which is about a very linear progression through simulated space and moving towards a goal, either beating the game in the end or surviving as long as you can. And I guess I'm curious, what results with Snowden drawing inspiration from video games, because if you think about original games as an extension of these very kind of utilitarian American national security interests, I would assume it's certainly not the intention of the US national security interest of security to create a cultural medium of games, which then kind of encourages its employees by training them as children to eventually go rogue and become whistleblowers. But I think the fact that Snowden found video games so formative in this way that was unexpected by their makers, I think relates and sheds light on the ways that people can repurpose the possibilities opened up by simulation. and kind of redesign them towards their own ends. Because there's something about simulation that makes the unbearable bearable. So things like death and distance and displacement, conflict, exploration, curiosity, and the depths of our own greed, our desire to accumulate, and the despair that comes about when we lose what's been accumulated. All of this kind of gets practiced and rehearsed in video games where the stakes aren't magnified into something life-size. So this is one example. I just have a few more examples and then we'll wrap up. This is an example of a YouTube user called, I guess, How Big is the Map? And so they take it upon themselves not to play these video games as they're traditionally designed to be played, but to have the main character wander across the entire simulated space represented in the video game. And here is a compilation of the 160 biggest game worlds. So as you can see, this person has put a lot of labor into this exercise, which when you're coming from a place of thinking about visual art seems like very much like a sort of conceptual piece. And there's something kind of amazing about the way that the main character, in doing this exercise, the way that the player opts out of the violence that's kind of assumed to take assumed to be an integral component of the game. I mean, that's not always true. Sometimes you see them like they're shooting at players to get through. But right now, the main activity is this sort of exploration of simulated geographical space. And this goes on and on. So there is another sort of repurposing, very famous repurposing of video games, which is very funny. And it's this idea of speed running. So this idea that you go through a video game, not to kind of accumulate all the points that the video game designer tried to entice you with, not to kind of beat the game or get the best gear or whatever, but to finish the game in the most efficient way possible. And that is actually the goal and the kind of seed of competition.
Speedrunner Nifsky
So
would achieve this run.
We see these speedrunners in some ways kind of refracting the logic of capitalist efficiency as they go about these games, not kind of seeking out any other goals, but just trying to finish the game as abruptly as possible. And there are actually kind of interesting overtones of video game speedrunning captured earlier in, this is a scene from Godard's Bande à Part, a scene where the characters decide to run through the Louvre Museum. And in doing so, they're trying to beat what they heard was a previous time.
Arthur déclara qu'il fallait attendre la nuit pour faire le coup, et respecter ainsi la tradition des mauvais policiers de série B. Que faire alors pour tuer le temps qui s'éternise, demanda Odile. Franz avait lu dans François qu'un Américain avait mis 9 minutes 45 secondes pour visiter le musée du Louvre. Ils décidèrent de faire mieux. En 9 minutes 43 secondes, Arthur, Odile et Franz avaient battu le record établi par Jimmy Johnson de San Francisco.
And so that's the clip, and I bring that up because I think there's something about the way people repurpose video games that I don't mean to say makes the medium either liberatory or repressive, but that I think it's interesting and important for us to look at the cultural force that they have, whatever it is that's compelling to people, and that can be repurposed in DIY ways, and towards you know, very unexpected individual ends. So that's my presentation. I'll stop sharing my screen now. And thank you all. I'm looking forward to reviewing everyone's kind of comments about your own encounters with video gaming. But in the meanwhile, as I understand it, I think we have a short break and then we'll reconvene, right?
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you so much for this impressive talk. Yes, we can have a 5-minute break, perhaps, and then we can have the Q&A, so we can also start checking and collecting the questions.
Recording stopped.